So today I'm here to talk about how the Second World War helped in the liberation of Africans from the colonial masters. How did the Second World War help in the decolonization of Africa? Now, the Second World War is known to have been fought in 1939 and ended in 1945. The war was said to involve the Allies and the Axis, the Allies of which was made up of Britain, France, and United States on the one hand, and the Axis, which were Germany, Japan, as well as Italy on the other hand. The Allied forces were known to emerge victorious. Now, the question is that how did this Second World War help Africans become decolonized or become liberated? Now, one of the points is that the Second World War helped in changing the perception or the preconception of Africans. Now, how did that happen? It is important to know that prior to First and Second World War, Africans had a misconception about the white people. Most Africans thought that the white men, some were gods. They even thought that the white man could not die or did not die. He was invincible. He was untouchable. Now, the reason why many Africans had such preconception was because, remember, like I treated in one of my videos, that on the eve of colonialism, Africans did not know that the white man had more superior weapons to them. And so when the Europeans arrived at the African continent, they killed Africans in mass. As a result of such victory over the Africans, it instilled a particular fear and even caused Africans to even mythologize and think so high of the Europeans, such that some assumed that the Europeans were very, very superior and were undefeatable, were invincible, and were even gods. But then, if you look at the history of Africa very well during the First and Second World War, you realize that very many Africans were conscripted alongside colonial soldiers to fight for their colonial masters against their enemies. And so in the Second World War, very many Africans fought very bravely alongside their colonial masters. And in this war, they noticed that the white man of whom they thought was invincible and more superior to them actually was no different from them, and that he cried, he even bled, and he even died like them. And so during this course of this war, it dawned on them that if these people were no superior to them, why then are they being ruled or dominated by them? And so at the end of the war, they returned with tales of bravery during the course of the war, and they told very many Africans how they fought bravely alongside their colonial masters, and that the colonial masters are not who they thought they were. And so when they returned back, they were able to also make up the large numbers of the nationalistic movement that were already existing prior to the end of the war. Now, another point to note is that the Second World War helped Africans question something they had not questioned before. I mean, they fought the First World War alongside colonial masters, but then the Second World War again, they came again, they fought. Now, in the course of this war, they noticed that this war was not them fighting for themselves. They were not fighting for themselves during the course of this war, but rather they were fighting on behalf of the colonial masters against not their own enemies, but the enemies of the colonial masters. And so they wondered that the colonial masters themselves, in a sense, were fighting for their own freedom, or were fighting to free, Europe from Nazism and fascism that was in existence during that period in time. And so the black men wondered, the Africans wondered that if we are fighting on behalf of some people, not for ourselves, why then won't we also use this same energy to fight for our own self? And so they returned back with this in mind, that they had already born, and then they came back and so fought for the cause of decolonization. Now, another point to note during this period in time is that after the Second World War, very many African countries began to push for decolonization and freedom and independence. And during this period, you will notice that Africans were more united than ever. Never had Africans been disunited like they were during the period of decolonization. If you look at pre-colonial Africa, you will see examples of which is the Mfeken. Africans were not as united as they were during the course of decolonization. Mfeken was a period that witnessed several conflicts among rising states in the southern area of Africa. And so, very many African entities at that period in time were at loggerheads with one another. Even if you look at West African history, with the collapse of the Oyo Empire, you will notice that the fledgling states around were conflicting with each other, and there were different intertribal wars even on the eve of colonialism. But then, during the course of decolonization, Africans united like never before. I also wish to see this kind of unity even today in Africa. Now, another point again to note is the external factor of which, when you look very well, you see that 1947, after the Second World War, India and Burma gained independence. India in 1947, Burma in 1948. These external factors also served to influence the course of decolonization in Africa, as the stories of other countries getting independence also inspired the ones which were still in colonial chains to seek independence and fight for it and also gain their freedom. Now, also it is important to know that although Britain and France emerged as victors from the war, but yet they emerged victorious but exhausted from the war. And so as a result of that, they were no longer the world powers at the end of the Second World War. Rather, United States and USSR became the world powers after the Second World War. In 1941, there was something known as the Atlantic Charter. The charter carried in it the agreement to grant determinational rule or self-rule to countries or continents that were under colonial rule. And so at the end of this charter, I think it was between the then president of United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and the then Prime Minister of Britain, which was Winston Churchill. And in it, Britain agreed that at the end of the war, they would grant self-determinational rule to countries that were under colonial chains or colonial domination. And so at the end of the war, with Britain and France no longer the world powers, no longer having the say that they did have prior to the war, they granted independence to very many countries that were under colonial rule. Now, another point again to notice was that the Second World War during the period, and even the First World War, as well as in between the wars, 1929, which was the Great Depression, you will notice that production was intensified on colonies, and the economic condition of colonies was so bad that it led to internal strife and internal agitation and even rise of labor movements during that period. Why? Was because although raw materials were exported in large number to support the troops and the economy of the war countries, but yet it is important to note that while there was large export from these colonies, the import did not equal the export of which was going out at that period in time. And so as a result, there was no economic balance between the colonies as well as their metropoles. And so during this period, we witnessed even in Nigeria, I think 1945, they had the 1945 general strike, as well as in other countries where they had economic strains that led to the rise of nationalistic groups and labor movements that continue to push for colonial breakouts. And so these are some of the points that I've been able to put out on how the Second World War helped in the liberation of Africa. I hope you did learn a thing or two from it. Now hit the like button and subscribe, and also share if you like what I'm doing. So I'll see you next time.